Hi there. Thanks for watching my video all the way through. My goal is to get 1,000 subscribers to my YouTube channel. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Let's move on to the stories. Story 1, The Hiker. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend. Rachel and Tom had been planning their hiking trip for months. They had chosen a remote trail in the Appalachian Mountains, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, where they could finally escape the pressures of work and daily life. The weather forecast promised clear skies and mild temperatures, ideal conditions for hiking. They arrived at the trailhead early on a Saturday morning. The parking lot was empty except for one other car, a dusty old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days. Rachel and Tom unloaded their backpacks, checked their map, and set off into the woods. The first few hours of the hike were peaceful. The trail wound through dense forests, over bubbling streams, and up gentle slopes. The couple chatted about their plans for the future, laughing and enjoying the beauty of nature. The air was crisp and clean, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the trail became steeper and more rugged. They decided to take a break on a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. As they sat there, catching their breath and admiring the scenery, Rachel noticed something strange in the distance. "Tom, look over there," she said, pointing to a spot further up the trail. "Do you see that?" Tom squinted in the direction she was pointing. At first he didn't see anything, but then he caught sight of it too, a figure standing on the edge of the cliff, far ahead of them. "Yeah, I see it." "Maybe it's another hiker," Tom suggested. "Maybe," Rachel replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The figure was just standing there, motionless, almost as if it was waiting for something. They watched for a few more minutes, but the figure didn't move. Finally, Tom shrugged and said, "Let's keep going. We'll probably catch up to them soon." They resumed their hike, but as they continued up the trail, the figure remained ahead of them, always at the edge of their vision, never getting any closer. It seemed to be leading them deeper into the mountains. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the trail. Rachel and Tom had been hiking for hours and were beginning to feel the strain. The trail had become more difficult, with loose rocks and narrow paths winding around steep cliffs. "We should set up camp soon," Tom said, glancing at the darkening sky. "It's going to be dark soon, and I don't want to be hiking in the dark." "Agreed," Rachel replied, her unease growing with every step. "But where's that other hiker? We should have caught up to them by now." Tom didn't have an answer. The figure had disappeared from view, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. They hadn't seen any signs of another campsite or even fresh footprints on the trail. As they searched for a suitable spot to camp, they came across a small clearing near the trail. It was an ideal location, flat, sheltered by trees, and with a small stream nearby. They quickly set up their tent and started a fire to ward off the evening chill. But even as they sat by the fire, cooking their dinner, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods around them were silent, unnaturally so. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, chirping insects, were absent. It was as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. "Do you feel that?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked up from the fire, his expression serious. "Yeah, I do. It's like something's wrong." They both scanned the darkening woods, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sounds, just the oppressive silence. "Let's just get some sleep," Tom finally said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll get an early start tomorrow and head back down." Rachel nodded, though she doubted she would be able to sleep at all. That night, Rachel was woken by a noise outside the tent. It was a soft, almost imperceptible rustling, like someone or something was moving just beyond the firelight. She held her breath, straining to hear. There it was again. A soft crunch of leaves, a snap of a twig. Whatever it was getting closer. "Tom," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Tom, listen." Tom groggily opened his eyes, but before he could say anything, they both heard a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere just outside the tent. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as fear washed over her. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Tom reached for the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The growling grew louder, more menacing, as if whatever was out there was warning them to stay inside. But Tom wasn't about to sit and wait for whatever it was to attack. He pushed the tent flap open and shone the flashlight into the darkness. At first, they saw nothing, just the flickering shadows of the trees. But then the light caught something, two glowing eyes, reflecting the beam back at them from the edge of the clearing. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The eyes were too high off the ground to belong to any animal she knew of. They were watching them, unblinking, cold, and calculating. "Stay here," Tom whispered, his voice tense. "I'll scare it off." He grabbed a stick from the fire and stepped out of the tent, brandishing the makeshift torch. But as soon as he took a step towards the eyes, they disappeared into the darkness. "Did you see that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Tom replied, his voice shaky. "I saw it. But whatever it was, it's gone now." They both returned to the tent, but sleep was impossible. They lay awake for hours, listening for any signs of movement outside. But the woods remained silent, as if the creature had never been there at all. The next morning, Rachel and Tom packed up their camp and started back down the trail. They were both exhausted, their nerves frayed from the night before. As they hiked, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the eyes in the darkness. What kind of creature had they seen? And why had it been watching them? The day passed slowly, the weight of the previous night hanging over them like a dark cloud. They were relieved when they finally reached the trailhead and saw their car waiting for them. But as they approached the parking lot, Rachel stopped in her tracks. The old pickup truck they had seen when they arrived was still there, but now it was covered in thick layers of dust, as if it hadn't moved in years. "Tom, look," she said, pointing to the truck. Tom frowned, walking over to it. He wiped a layer of dust from the windshield and peered inside. There, on the driver's seat, was a map, an old, weathered map of the trail they had just hiked, and next to it was a pair of hiking boots, caked in mud, the laces frayed and worn. But what made Rachel's blood run cold was the photograph tucked into the sun visor. It was a picture of a man and a woman, standing at the edge of the same cliff where they had seen the figure in the distance. The man was smiling, but the woman had no eyes, just empty, black sockets staring out from the photograph, as if she was still watching them, even now. Rachel and Tom left the parking lot as fast as they could, the sense of being watched never leaving them. They never returned to that trail, and the memory of those empty eyes haunted them for the rest of their lives. Story 2. The Lake House. Jennifer and Michael had long dreamed of a quiet weekend away from the city. Like many young couples, they were worn out by the noise of urban life and the constant rush. This time, they decided to head to a small lake that their friend Tom had told them about. He mentioned an old house on the shore, where he used to spend summer vacations with his family. The house had been empty for several years, but Tom assured them it was still a cozy place for a weekend getaway. Jennifer and Michael didn't hesitate. They rented the house, packed their car with food and essentials, and set off. The drive to the lake was long. They left the city early in the morning and arrived at the house by evening. The house was picturesque, despite its weathered condition. It stood right on the lake's edge, surrounded by tall pines. The water was dark and calm, reflecting the thick clouds that had begun to gather in the sky. The porch creaked under their feet as they climbed the steps, and the door opened with a groan, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Inside, it was dusty but cozy. The walls were adorned with old photographs, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. They unpacked, tidied up the house, and lit a fire in the fireplace. Finally, they settled on the couch with a bottle of wine, discussing their plans for the next 2 days. But something elusive bothered Jennifer. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the house felt like it was holding someone else's presence. Maybe it was the fact that no one had lived there for a long time, and the atmosphere, heavy with memories, weighed on her. Michael, on the other hand, was in high spirits and dismissed her concerns. "Jen, you're just too impressionable," he said with a smile, pouring them both another glass of wine. "It's just an old house. Tomorrow, we'll go for a swim and explore the surroundings. You'll see, it'll be great." But Jennifer couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the night grew darker, the wind began to howl outside, and the house seemed to creak and groan with each gust. That night, Jennifer had a strange dream. She was walking along the lake shore when she saw a little girl standing by the water. The girl's back was turned to her, and she was holding something in her hands, something that glittered in the moonlight. Jennifer tried to approach her, but the girl suddenly turned, revealing a pale, lifeless face with hollow eyes. She whispered something Jennifer couldn't understand, and then she vanished into the lake's depths. Jennifer woke up with a start, covered in cold sweat. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of the wind outside. She glanced over at Michael, who was fast asleep beside her. The dream had left her with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. In the morning, she told Michael about the dream, but he just laughed it off. "It's just a dream, Jen. You're letting this place get to you." They spent the day exploring the area around the lake. The woods were dense, and the paths seemed barely used. They found an old, overgrown trail that led to a small, abandoned dock on the far side of the lake. The water was still and dark, just as it had been the day before. As they stood on the dock, Michael suggested they take a boat out onto the lake. Jennifer hesitated, but eventually agreed, hoping it would help shake off the eerie feeling that had been hanging over her since they arrived. They found an old rowboat tied to the dock and decided to take it out. The boat creaked as they pushed it into the water, and Jennifer couldn't help but notice how murky the lake was. The water was so dark that it was impossible to see more than a few inches below the surface. As they rowed out to the center of the lake, the wind picked up and the sky grew darker. Jennifer felt a growing sense of unease. The further they got from the shore, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Michael, still trying to lighten the mood, joked about the lake monster that was surely lurking in the depths. But Jennifer wasn't laughing. She kept glancing over the side of the boat, half expecting to see something emerge from the black water. Suddenly, the boat lurched, as if something had bumped into it from below. Jennifer gasped and grabbed onto the sides of the boat, her heart racing. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah, probably just a fish," Michael replied, though he sounded less confident now. But when the boat lurched again, harder this time, Jennifer's fear turned to panic. "Michael, let's go back," she pleaded. He nodded, and they began to row back towards the shore, but the boat seemed to move slower than before, as if something was holding it back. The water around them began to ripple, and Jennifer noticed bubbles rising to the surface. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized something was beneath them, something large. Before they could react, the boat was violently overturned, and they were plunged into the cold, dark water. Jennifer surfaced, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The water was freezing, and she struggled to stay afloat. "Michael," she screamed, but there was no response. She frantically searched the water around her, but there was no sign of him. The overturned boat bobbed nearby, but Michael was gone. Panic set in as she realized she was alone in the middle of the lake. The dark water seemed to close in around her, pulling her down. She could feel something brushing against her legs, something cold and slimy. Desperately, she swam towards the shore, her limbs growing numb from the cold. But the distance seemed to stretch on forever, and the shore felt impossibly far away. As she struggled to stay afloat, she saw something in the water ahead of her, Michael, or what was left of him. His body floated lifelessly on the surface, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sky. But there was something wrong with his face. His eyes were black, like the eyes of the girl in her dream. Jennifer screamed, her mind unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She turned and swam in the opposite direction, not caring where she ended up, as long as she could get away from the horror in the water. Finally, she reached the shore, collapsing onto the muddy ground, gasping for breath. She looked back at the lake, but there was no sign of Michael's body or the overturned boat. The water was calm and still, as if nothing had happened. Shaking, Jennifer staggered back to the house, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. She was alone, trapped in this nightmare. She spent the rest of the day pacing the house, her mind replaying the events on the lake over and over. As night fell, she locked all the doors and windows, terrified that whatever had taken Michael would come for her next. But the house offered little comfort. The wind howled outside, and the walls creaked as if the house itself was alive. Jennifer sat in the corner of the living room, clutching a blanket, her eyes darting around the room, expecting something to emerge from the shadows. As the night dragged on, Jennifer's fear turned to despair. She couldn't escape the feeling that the lake was calling to her, pulling her back to its dark depths. She fought the urge to go outside, knowing that if she did, she might never come back. But as the clock struck midnight, she heard a faint tapping at the window. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned to look. There, standing outside in the moonlight, was the little girl from her dream. Her pale face was expressionless, and her black eyes stared directly at Jennifer. Jennifer froze, her blood running cold. The girl raised her hand and pointed towards the lake. "No," Jennifer whispered, shaking her head. "No, I'm not going out there." But the girl didn't move, didn't lower her hand. She just stood there, pointing, her eyes locked on Jennifer's. And then, Jennifer heard the sound of the front door creaking open, followed by footsteps on the porch. She turned towards the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, the door to the living room began to open, and in the doorway stood Michael. But it wasn't the Michael she knew. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were black, just like the girl's. "Jennifer," he whispered, his voice hollow and lifeless. "Come with me." Jennifer screamed, backing away from the door, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. Michael took a step towards her, his hand outstretched. "Come back to the lake," he said, his voice like a cold wind. "No," Jennifer cried, but her voice was weak, and her body felt like it was being pulled towards him, towards the darkness. And then, everything went black. When Jennifer woke up, she was lying on the shore of the lake, the cold water lapping at her feet. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the water. She sat up, shivering, and looked around. The house was just visible in the distance, but it felt like it was a world away. She didn't remember how she had gotten there, but she knew one thing for certain: Michael was gone, and she was alone. Jennifer stumbled to her feet and started walking towards the house, but something caught her eye: a piece of paper floating in the water. She reached down and picked it up, her hands trembling. It was an old photograph, waterlogged and faded, but she could still make out the figures in it. It was a picture of a family, 2 parents, and a little girl standing on the shore of the lake, just like the one she had seen in her dream. But the girl's face was different. Her eyes were black, just like the girl in Jennifer's dream, just like Michael's. Jennifer dropped the photo and ran back to the house. She packed her things as quickly as she could and left, not looking back. As she drove away, the sun rose higher in the sky, and the lake was once again calm and still. But Jennifer knew she would never forget what had happened there, and she would never return. A few weeks later, she received a letter. It had no return address, and inside was just one photo of the lake at sunset, and in its dark water, the distorted face of Jennifer, staring back at her from the depths. Story 3: Empty Eyes. When Sarah and Jason moved into their new home on the outskirts of a small New England town, they couldn't believe their luck. The house was big, cozy, and surprisingly affordable. The neighbors were friendly, and the neighborhood was quiet. They quickly made friends with the locals, and their son, Jacob, found new friends of his own. However, on the first night in their new home, Sarah felt something strange. She woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching her. She looked around the room but saw no one and convinced herself it was just the stress of the move. But the feeling of unease lingered, as if the house had a presence that refused to remain hidden. The following weekend, Jason had to leave on a business trip, leaving Sarah and Jacob alone in the house. On Friday night, after putting Jacob to bed, Sarah sat in the living room, sipping tea and reading a book. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. As she turned a page, Sarah heard a soft knock at the window. She looked up, expecting to see a tree branch or some other logical explanation, but the window was clear. She got up, walked over to the window, and peered outside into the darkness. Nothing but the faint outline of the trees in the yard. Shrugging it off, Sarah returned to her book, but the knock came again, louder this time. It was as if someone was tapping lightly on the glass, trying to get her attention. She set her book down and walked to the front door, checking the lock. The door was secure. Still uneasy, she made a round of the house, checking all the windows and doors. Everything was locked tight. Just as she was about to head back to the living room, she heard a soft, whispery voice, almost like a child's, coming from the direction of Jacob's room. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly rushed to check on him. Jacob was sound asleep, undisturbed. But as she stood there, she heard the whisper again, this time more distinct. "Mommy, come play." Sarah's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't Jacob's. It was coming from the corner of the room near the closet. She turned towards the sound, but the corner was empty, just darkness. She quickly left the room, her heart pounding in her chest, and grabbed her phone to call Jason. As she dialed his number, the house suddenly went dark. The power had gone out, leaving her in complete darkness. Panic gripped Sarah as she fumbled in the dark for a flashlight. She found one in the kitchen drawer and turned it on, the weak beam of light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. She tried calling Jason again, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. Slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of Jacob's room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Someone or something was in the house with her. She forced herself to move, running back to Jacob's room. She found him still asleep, unaware of the growing terror in his mother's heart. But as she stood by his bed, the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the door. The door creaked open slowly, and Sarah's flashlight flickered. In the dim light, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a child, but not her child. This child was pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all the light, leaving nothing but darkness in their place. "Mommy, come play," the figure whispered again, its voice echoing in the stillness of the room. Sarah backed away, her hand gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. The figure stepped into the room, its hollow eyes fixed on her. It was a little girl, wearing a tattered dress, her skin ashen and lifeless. "Mommy," the girl repeated, "come play." Sarah could barely breathe. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the girl was there, standing in front of her, reaching out a hand. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Jacob and ran from the room, slamming the door behind her. She raced down the stairs and out the front door, not stopping until she was in the middle of the yard, gasping for breath. She looked back at the house, expecting to see the girl standing at the window, but there was nothing. Just the dark silhouette of the house against the night sky. Sarah spent the rest of the night in the car with Jacob, too afraid to go back inside. She kept the doors locked and the engine running, the headlights illuminating the front of the house. But nothing moved. The night was silent, and the house stood still, as if waiting. When morning finally came, Sarah called Jason again, and this time the call went through. She told him everything, her voice trembling. Jason tried to reassure her, suggesting it was just a nightmare or a trick of the mind. But Sarah knew what she had seen. They decided to stay at a hotel for the rest of the weekend, not wanting to return to the house. When Jason came home on Sunday, they both returned to the house together, but nothing seemed out of place. No signs of the little girl, no more strange noises. It was as if the house had returned to normal. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. She insisted they move out, but Jason was reluctant, thinking it was just her imagination. So they stayed, though Sarah never felt at ease again. A few weeks later, Jason was out for the evening, leaving Sarah and Jacob alone in the house once more. She put Jacob to bed early and settled down to watch TV, trying to distract herself from the creeping sense of dread that had taken root in her mind. As she sat there, the power went out again, plunging the house into darkness. This time, Sarah was prepared. She grabbed a flashlight and checked the house, finding nothing out of the ordinary. But the fear was there, gnawing at her, whispering that something was watching. She returned to the living room and sat in the dark, the flashlight flickering weakly. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. And then she heard it again, the soft knock at the window. She turned the flashlight towards it, but the beam barely reached the glass. She stood up, slowly approaching the window, her heart pounding. As she got closer, she saw two hollow eyes staring back at her from the darkness outside. The little girl was back, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes empty voids. "Mommy," the girl whispered, "come play." Sarah screamed and stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and dropping the flashlight. The light went out, plunging her into total darkness. She scrambled to her feet and ran upstairs to Jacob's room, but when she opened the door, her heart stopped. The little girl was standing over Jacob's bed, her hand reaching out to him. "Mommy, come play with us." Sarah rushed forward, but the girl turned to face her, her hollow eyes boring into Sarah's soul. The room seemed to twist and warp around her, the walls closing in. "No," Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed her whole, pulling her down into the abyss, where the girl's voice echoed in her mind. When Jason returned home that night, he found the house in darkness. The power was out, and Sarah and Jacob were nowhere to be found. He searched the house, calling their names, but there was no answer. In Jacob's room, he found the flashlight lying on the floor, its batteries dead. The window was open, the curtains billowing in the cold night air. Jason searched the neighborhood, calling out for his wife and son, but they were gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. The police searched for weeks, but there were no leads, no clues as to what had happened. The only thing they found was a note, scrawled in a child's handwriting, left on Jacob's pillow. It read, "Mommy came to play." Jason never saw Sarah or Jacob again. The house was eventually sold, but the new owners didn't stay long. They, too, reported strange noises, whispers in the dark, and the feeling of being watched. The house still stands, empty and cold, waiting for its next occupants. But those who know its history stay far away, for they have heard the stories of the little girl with hollow eyes, waiting for someone to come play with her. And once you do, you never leave.